Today, we have three bills, and we're going to begin with House File 295, Representative Muller. It's always a delight to have Representative Muller back before us. And so, Representative Muller, the chair will move to refer House File 295 to the Committee on Ways and Means. Please come forward, state your name for the record, and let's begin the testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. It is great to be back again. So House File 295 would require the BCA to investigate sexual assaults that are perpetrated by and against members of the Minnesota National Guard. The idea for this bill started a few years ago when I met with Shayla Shull, a constituent, who told me about the assault she endured as a member of the National Guard at the hands of another Guard member. Through Shayla, I met other brave survivors, some of whom you'll hear from today. And for these crimes, it's up to local law enforcement agencies to investigate them. The survivors told me that the delays in investigations at the local level held things up for the military investigation, and the inconsistency among investigations at the local level can also create challenges, not only for survivors, but for the military investigation that follows. Upon hearing from these survivors, I talked to the National Guard and learned about their report, the Minnesota National Guard Sexual Assault Prevention and Response Review Board. The report was released in March of 2020, and it's included in your packet. Recommendation 1.4 includes a suggestion that the BCA act as the investigative agency for sexual assault investigations. We've tried to be very clear with the language of the bill that the BCA investigation applies only to Minnesota Guard members who are sexually assaulted by other Minnesota Guard members, and the local law enforcement agency knows that both are Guard members. This bill has bipartisan support, and Senator Duckworth has introduced the companion, and the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault supports this bill. And with that, Mr. Chair, I have several testifiers ready to go.
Very well. Thank you, Representative Muller. I do have a list here. And so what I have is first up, Shayla Shull, who I had the pleasure of briefly meeting as we discussed Texas weather a few minutes ago. Ms. Shull, welcome to the committee. Please state your name for the record and please provide us with your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Specialist Shayla Shull. I'm here today to testify in support of House File 295. As Kelly stated, I am the reason for this legislation being introduced. In 2016, I was sexually assaulted by another guardsman the night I graduated advanced individual training. I attempted to report the sexual assault, but was discouraged from reporting by local law enforcement. After that experience, I didn't have the motivation or the energy to act on it further. Then in late 2017, after finishing treatment for stage 4 blood cancer, I received messages on Facebook from a civilian woman asking about what had been done to me. It turns out that everything that was done to me was also done to her too. After confirming to this then stranger that I too was sexually assaulted by the same person, we were both now part of a sexual assault investigation that would span 2.5 years. I spent a little over half of my obligation to the Minnesota Army National Guard in a sexual assault investigation. This isn't uncommon, and this is the average length of the investigation according to the state's last SAPR review board. What you don't see is the toll this is taking on me and my family, my friends, and my children. By the time this investigation neared its end in mid-2019, I had delivered my first child. Going through a sexual assault case when you're pregnant with your first child is traumatic in its own special way when you have constant ultrasounds. I don't remember any of my children's birth because I requested to be sedated to ensure that I not remember being touched by anybody. I could not breastfeed because I did not feel as though I had yet regained control over my own body. The stress and anxiety contributed to postpartum preeclampsia, and I almost died. Sorry. You see, Mr. Chairman, the reason why I'm here today is not because I wanted justice for myself. I carried the weight of the sexual assault for a year before I reported. I reported after I was approached by somebody else who also endured the sexual assault. But I will forever sit with the guilt of being a service member in a group of civilian women who look to me to be, to meet, to follow, to uphold, and exceed the standard of the law, and somebody who puts service before self. Reporting put a target on my back that I will have to live with forever, but that is the cross that I will bear if it prevents others from carrying the same. That is one hell of a weight to carry. I continue to serve beyond my obligation to the National Guard, now in the Army Reserve in Texas with my active duty spouse. But Minnesota is and will always be my home. With this legislation, it'll ensure that soldiers and airmen of this organization are entitled to timely and unbiased sexual assault investigations so we can continue to serve in our community safely. I urge you to vote yes on House File 295. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Specialist Shull. I wish you well on your road to healing. I trust all our committee members up here do as well. What happened to you, you did not deserve. It is not your fault. There's nothing that who you are, merits, the crime committed on you and on your person. I want to thank you for the courage to be here before us in public as you serve, our citizens. Obviously, you're serving it in your service as a Guard member, but you're also serving it with the testimony that you've given here today. Let's work together to honor your presence and your words. So thank you for being with us today. If you're able to stay for a bit, that would be not necessary, but welcome. We typically will go through our list of testifiers, and then there may be questions or comments that committee members may want to direct at you, if that's okay.
Absolutely, Mr. Chairman. Thank you so much.
Very well. Thank you, Specialist Shull. Next up, we have Donald Kerr, Minnesota Department of Military Affairs, Executive Director. Welcome to the committee, Mr. Kerr. Please state your name for the record and provide us with your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For the record, I am Don Kerr, the Executive Director of the Department of Military Affairs. And though the department normally remains neutral in legislation that doesn't apply directly to the military code, we really strongly support this bill because we think it'll close a critical gap that we have in conducting timely, credible, and consistent investigations that we can then use to enforce discipline of the National Guard, protect our service members in this area of great concern. And that's my short statement, Mr. Chair, and I will hang around in case any members of the chair have any questions.
Very well. Thank you, Executive Director Kerr. Thank you for your presence here today and for your encouragement of this bill. Yes, if you could, in case there are questions, we greatly would appreciate that. Next, we have Mr. John Thompson, Minnesota National Guard Sexual Assault Response Coordinator. Mr. Thompson, welcome to the committee. Please state your name for the record and please give us your testimony.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, and thank you. For the record, I'm John Thompson, the Sexual Assault Response Coordinator for the Minnesota National Guard. The Minnesota National Guard requires a strong base of foundational trust and faith from our membership. And I believe that this bill would help to reinforce the trust and faith that we require from our members. Anything that we can do to shorten the timelines that Ms. Shull, Specialist Shull brought up when it comes to the criminal investigative process would be a win, not just for the victims and survivors. It would also be a win for the organization. And it would also be a win, and this may be odd to say in this surrounding, but it would be a win for the offenders as well, whose lives are often put on hold while the investigation takes place. And I will also stay on the call if there's any questions that I can answer, sir. Thank you.
Very well. Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Next, we have Bonnie Daniels, a Minnesota National Guard member. Welcome to the committee. Please state your name for the record and please provide us with your testimony. Representative Muller, I know earlier before the committee we were trying to figure out because of some of the technical issues that they might be facing, that there might be a technical connection, but let's see if that, or technical connection problem, but let's see if that's the case.
I think they were muted, Mr. Chair. I think the two are in the same room,
Oh,
perhaps.
okay. Well, let's see if they hear us, if they can unmute.
Can you hear me?
Yes, indeed. Welcome.
My name is Bonnie Daniels, and I am here today to testify in support of House File 295. I was sexually assaulted by my Master Sergeant on January 9th of 2016. It was a drill weekend. Prior to the assault, I had always thought of myself as being extremely goal-oriented, outgoing, happy, and carefree. I just graduated and was planning for my career in the Houston, Texas Medical Center as an X-ray tech. The sexual assault changed everything. My always positive attitude was non-existent. I blamed myself. I told myself things like, it's my fault I had a drink with him. I should have known better. Nobody actually cares about me. Nobody will believe me. I'm annoying people. I'm crazy. People will think I'm overreacting. I can't trust anybody. Men only want me for sex. I'm not good enough. I'm worthless. A nobody. Those feelings of guilt and shame haunted me throughout the investigation, as well as the sickness in my stomach, hearing I wasn't the only one. I had my first thoughts of suicide right before my 29th birthday, a little over a year and a half after I reported the sexual assault. Shortly after my first thoughts of suicide, I drove to the VA in Houston for an appointment with the military sexual trauma coordinator. She was surprised I hadn't canceled that appointment because it was the first day Hurricane Harvey hit Houston in August of 2017. I told her I had called for help once before, a few months after I was sexually assaulted, because I knew I needed help, but nobody called me back. It took me over a year and a half to call again. If I had canceled that appointment, I didn't know how long it would be before I had the courage to call again, if I even made it that long. The entire investigation took 2 years to complete. Please vote yes to House File 295. When it comes to someone's life, every second counts. Vote yes to ensure them of a timely investigation, which would provide them with that piece of closure that is needed to truly begin to heal. 2 years is too long. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Daniels. And are you still part of the Guard at this point?
I am not.
Okay, all right. Ms. Daniels, as I shared with Specialist Shull earlier, you have the sincerest best wishes of this committee and your role to wholeness. And please know that we see you and we see you in your dignified wholeness. And I can't express enough my appreciation for your courage to give voice to what needs to be given voice to, so that we can end the behavior, the crime that was committed against you, that had nothing to do with anything of who you are. So thank you again for being with us here today. If you're able to stay for questions and comments, I'd appreciate that as well, but there's no need to. But please know that you're welcome to stay for questions period as well. With that, members, we're going to move to Sarah Kostik. Sarah Kostik, if you can state your name for the record and provide us with your testimony, that would be welcome.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. My name is Sarah Kostik. I'm here today to testify in support of Bill 295. You see, in 2014, I was sexually assaulted by my first sergeant, the senior most enlisted member in the unit. Because the National Guard requires us to go to civilian law enforcement to report cases first, I had to report my assault with local law enforcement. The local law enforcement did not take my case serious at all. They asked me if I was at a local bar off post, if I would report it as well. From there, I became one of the first Minnesotans to experience a complex investigation. This is where a team of senior military members traveled to Minnesota to investigate the crime. They then continued to Washington National Guard Bureau to review the findings and make a decision. This was almost a 2-year process. The investigation resulted in an honorable discharge of my first sergeant. Nothing was noted on his record, and he continued to serve as a police officer in his hometown. Speed up to 2019, I started talking about my experience and hope that others wouldn't feel alone. I shared the story with a new friend. She replied back, "What is his name?" Once I told her, she stated, "That's not the worst he has done." That statement from her still haunts me today. If it's not the worst he has done, and if he used and abused his power in the military, what is he doing as a police officer? Please vote yes on HF 295 so the criminals can be taken off civilian streets as well as military ones. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Kostik. And I know I've said it already. And when you say things repeatedly, it almost sounds to some folks like you don't mean it, but I do mean it. And I know this committee means it as well in terms of expressing its appreciation of you as a person, of seeing you as a dignified person, as knowing that what was perpetrated against you was not anything that came about because of who you are. And we are deeply appreciative for your courage and your willingness to be here today to tell us your story and to encourage us to create laws that can help protect and help make sure that when there's wrongdoing, that in fact, when crimes like this happen and are perpetrated, that we will act. And preferably, we're acting in a way that prevent them in the first place. But thank you for being with us today. Members, we have several members who have comments and questions. Let me just very quickly to Representative Muller, and I would certainly invite Mr. Kirk, Thompson, Mr. Thompson with the department to comment as well. Maybe just a very quick, context thing. So I'm learning a few things here, Representative Muller. One of the things I'm hearing is that there's this requirement that there be a civilian investigation first. I think that's what I heard. And without passing judgment on it, I'm just curious if that is in fact the case, and what is the what is the principle and what are the principles that are behind that? So anyway, just generally from a total layperson's perspective, just to understand how things up to now typically proceed and what the rationale is for that.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yes, I am learning about all things National Guard too throughout my process with this bill, but I think the best person to perhaps address those specific questions is Mr. Thompson.
Very well, Mr. Thompson.
Thank you once again, Mr. Chairman. So when it comes to sexual assault within the military, the National Guard is much different. It has a much different process than the active component. The active component, when a sexual assault occurs, it's done in an unrestricted manner, the reporting, there's going to be an investigation. Those investigations are typically conducted by a military investigative branch, such as CID in the Army. Most people are more familiar with NCIS for the Navy and Marine Corps from the television show. We in the National Guard do not have our own internal investigative capabilities. So we're required to have an unbiased, independent investigation. And our regulatory requirements have us do that through local law enforcement. So whatever local law enforcement agency has jurisdiction where the sexual assault took place, that's where we make our notification. And when you think about Minnesota, because we have Guard members scattered around the state, 14,000 just about is our membership. We're trying to establish and maintain working relationships with all of these different city police departments, county sheriff's departments, and both city and county prosecutors' offices. And sometimes, even though we hope for a standard approach to the investigation and to the justice piece, there's all slight differences in a lot of these departments. Some of it has to do with manning and staffing and the resources that are available. So we feel that having the BCA is, if you want to call it, a one-stop shop for our investigative needs, that would speak to a standard of service in one sense. And again, anything that we can do to shorten the timelines is going to be a win for all parties. Our Adjutant General has said, slow justice is often perceived as no justice, and this is another one of those instances. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. That's very helpful for me, and I certainly beginning to appreciate the complexity of interacting with so many different units, and of course, part of our law enforcement design, if you will, in our state is to honor the fact that different communities have different dynamics at play, even as you mentioned, there's always a need for a strong element of uniformity to ensure that people's rights are being honored and followed. All right, very well. We have Representative Grosso, followed by Representative Long. Representative Grosso.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Representative Muller, for bringing this forward. I think you answered some of my questions as far as my concern was to how is this going to mesh with the UCMJ, and I think you guys have that part of it worked out, from what I understand. Is that correct?
And that's to
Representative Muller.
Very well, Representative Muller.
Or whoever can answer that.
Very well.
Yeah, I'll let Mr. Thompson answer that.
Very well, Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So when you look at the Uniform Code of Military Justice, the UCMJ, that is more applicable to active duty. There is also a document, an entity referred to as the Minnesota Code of Military Justice, the MCMG, that more addresses our Title 32 service. So there are differences. We work continually to try to create more parallels between the two, but just based off of our service as National Guard members, there's some differences. So this also would address some of those differences without like stepping on anyone's toes.
Representative Rossi.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for that answer, sir. With that being said, what I'm hearing is that there's this delay. There's a delay with investigation. There's a delay with the process in the civilian world, and as far as these three ladies, these three testifiers that were just there, I'm sorry that happened. I mean, that should never happen to any woman. And please, I just my thoughts and prayers are with all of you that healing comes, and it comes completely for you. With that being said, you're going at this, Representative Muller, you're going at this from the angle of putting some more BCA agents to help expedite this process. Am I correct in what I'm hearing?
Representative Muller.
That's right, Mr. Chair, Representative Grosso. It's really to not only expedite the process, but also that consistency of reporting. As Mr. Thompson said, these are occurring all over the state, and they have all these different kinds of relationships with different agencies. And so it's also not only to enhance the speed with which these happen, but the consistency.
Representative Grosso.
Mr. Chair, thank you. And I know both you and Representative O'Neill were working on that, reforming the crim sex code as well. Is this something that could be implemented also into helping the process go quicker for sexual assault across the board?
Representative Muller.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And yes, Representative Grosso, you're going to be hearing that bill on Thursday.
Mm-hmm.
The working group was just tasked with looking at the criminal sexual assault statutes, not necessarily the investigations. There were a number of other recommendations that were made. And you might recall in 2019, part of our omnibus bill was passed to have for the post board to create standards around sexual assault investigations. And so, that work is being done at the civilian level. So really our focus right now is just on having the BCA investigate those cases involving guard-on-guard assaults.
Very well.
Mr. Chair.
Representative Grosso.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And that's, that's what I want to make sure that this is going to help to make sure that those investigations, both civilian and National Guard, are expedited, get these things moving, get this justice for these victims, et cetera. And this is something I'd like to see you guys consider on that council, or that committee as well, to implement something like this. Last thing here, I had a similar conversation with the AG's office in reference to helping local agencies, local prosecutors with these heavier lift type cases. These sexual assault cases take some time, from what I was told, and such, and what I've experienced, that to have the AG's office do like they did back when I was on a task force for when the methamphetamine labs, the mom and pop labs, were exploding over the state. They had a special prosecutors group that would go to these areas, take these heavy loads off of local prosecutors, because it was a very time-consuming process, that it would take them, free them up to go back to doing their county work, and these state prosecutors from the AG's office would do this. Is that something that would also be something to talk about, to help make sure that these cases don't get stretched out and on and on and on, to where you get the AG's office with a task force, you have a task force such, agents specialized in the BCA to help with the investigation, to expedite that. Then you have special prosecutors from the AG's office come in and help with the prosecution part of it.
Excellent observations and points, Representative Muller, quickly, and then we're going to move to the next questioner.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative Grosso, it's not part of this bill, but I'd certainly be glad to have further conversations with you about that. I worked at the Attorney General's office in the criminal division at the time they were handling those meth cases, as you mentioned. I believe there was some federal funding involved in that. So of course, anything that we would do like this would require adequately funding the Attorney General's office if we were to shift that function over to them. But I'd be glad to talk with you further about that.
Let's visit. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you, Representative Grosso. Representative Long, followed by Representative O'Neill. Representative Long.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just real quick, before I turn to my question, Representative Grosso, I carried a bill last year that would have funded that work at the Attorney General's office, and would be happy to follow up with you about that. I just want to thank Representative Muller for bringing this bill forward, and the three testifiers for bravely sharing their stories. And I'm really hopeful that we can take your words to heart and take action on this bill. It feels like there's real need for consistency if we're having these folks who are coming from all over the state, potentially to places like Camp Ripley or elsewhere, and that having local law enforcement sort of deal with a state problem doesn't necessarily make that much sense. And my question for Mr. Thompson is, when you have local law enforcement dealing with residents of different parts of the state, have you seen that become a challenge in the investigations, both in terms of the timeline and in terms of consistent results?
Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Representative Long, absolutely. When we're talking about the logistics of travel to, both from the law enforcement standpoint or a service member standpoint, trying to make those connections to conduct interviews for the investigation. If the more widespread, the victim, the witnesses, the offender, members of the chain of command, it does add time to the process.
Representative Long.
Thank you, Mr.
So
Chair.
I would say yes, that's a definite concern.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. This just seems fundamentally different from, a typical investigation where folks might live in the same community, and having the BCA involved, I think, makes a ton of sense. So thank you, Representative Muller, for bringing this forward.
Thank you, Representative Long. I apologize, Representative or Mr. Thompson. I jumped in. a little prematurely. The video got stuck on my end, so my apology for that. Yeah, members, I am struck by, I mean, we always talk about this in this committee, just, you know, the incredible logistical challenges of space and distance in our state, as well as just the natural diversity that we have across different communities here, poses a particular challenge that perhaps in its worst case makes it you know, inviting for wrongdoers to exploit. So for us to be able to fill in and fill in those gaps and prevent that kind of intentional exploitation is critically important. Representative O'Neill, followed by Representative Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to thank Representative Muller for bringing yet another great bill. And this is moving the needle forward again. It is taking a step in the right direction to change the culture and to seek justice for those that have not had justice. And again, I am struck by hearing the same story of serial rapists allowed to continue to rape more and more and more women. And that's just what rings in my ears. And maybe it's because I also am a survivor, and so I'm very sensitive to that. That's why we did the test all rape kit bill, and now we're going to be seeking justice and getting justice for women that have been raped and putting behind bars, hopefully, the serial rapists that are doing the raping. To all the survivors, thank you so much for your courage to come forward today. You are making a huge difference from one survivor to another. You are brave. You are amazing. And I am incredibly grateful that you came and you shared your story. And just know that when you leave, that you have left a very important part of you, which is the truth and what really happened. And you are going to affect change here in the state of Minnesota. You are the change makers. And I just want to thank you, and Representative Muller and I have worked very hard in the past and will continue in the future to make sure that you have justice. So, and I'm a Republican and she's a Democrat, and we don't think that rape should be partisan. Isn't that a crazy thing? Rape is not partisan. Justice for rape victims is not partisan. So thank you for your stories. Thank you for your courage. Continue to tell your story and to help others heal. And again, just thank you so much. I don't have any questions. I'm just very, very grateful for Representative Muller's bill. And I know that my whole team will be supporting this today, and we will be glad to support it. Thank you.
Well said, Representative O'Neill. Thank you. Representative Johnson.
Chair Mariani, Representative Muller, thank you for this bill. I understand this, and I'm in shock that our National Guard does not have a CID unit. They have a JAG, but the commanders appoint somebody to do the investigations on issues, not only like this, but even other issues. I would love to see this bill go to Veterans Affairs so they can ask Brigadier Commander or General Mankey, who happens to be my constituent, if he plans to get something like this started, because this is something that they should be doing, because I think it's important that they should be investigating not just those but other things, because they have a lot more latitude and they can actually get things done quicker through the CID unit. Or they have so that's an issue that I was shocked when I heard. I want to thank, of course, thank the first testifier, Ms. Scroll, for her testimony today. And I hope that she still remembers the name of that officer who said that didn't want to do anything to report him to her as chief law enforcement officer, because that officer should not be there. He has a duty and responsibility. The vast majority of officers don't do stuff like that. It's the lazy ones that shouldn't have that job, that should be talked to and disciplined. We need to do whatever we can to help these victims and make sure the perpetrators are behind bars, whether it's in the military stockade or the civilian prison system. We need to get these perpetrators off the streets and away from their targets and get them the help and help the victims as much as possible. I'm going to be voting for this bill in favor of it, but like I said, I'd love to see it go to Veteran Affairs because this is a issue that needs to be talked about in the Veterans Affairs Committee as well, and to find out why these things weren't handled properly to begin with, and take a good deep look at what they need to be doing as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Representative Johnson. I think fair observations. And Representative Mulder, I know it might stretch beyond the language in the bill, but I'm just curious if perhaps Mr. Kerr or Mr. Thompson, but perhaps Mr. Kirk can share a little bit about whether any discussions or thoughts within the Guard itself relative to CID unit creation. I would not have that prejudice this bill one way or the other, but just out of our own curiosity and perhaps Representative Johnson may have identified another element that might need to be addressed at some point.
Mr. Chair.
Yes, Mr. Kirk, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I'd be happy to address that, sir. The force structure of the National Guard, which determines what units we have, is determined at the federal level. And the feds have not allocated any CID or Air Force investigation force structure for a fairly simple reason. From their perspective, they need those capabilities to be able to investigate federal crimes under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. And the reality is there are 54 different solutions for the state codes that replicate that Uniform Code of Military Justice. And so there has been no force structure made available to the states. We actually have been pursuing Criminal Investigation Division force structure for at least 15 years. That was one of the tasks I had when I was the Director of Plans and Policy for the Minnesota National Guard. But there simply is no force structure available from the federal government, and they do control how that force structure is allocated. There is also a jurisdictional issue in state law that does govern that jurisdiction primarily goes to civil authorities first. There are some certain circumstances, and generally sexual assault cases fall into this category where we do have secondary jurisdiction. That's where we run into these things. But there are certain things that are very important to us in the military, particularly in the relationship between the victim and the perpetrator, where there's a superior in one position or the other. That matters to us. It does not matter in the civilian world. So that's something that we're very interested in, but a county prosecutor may not see a crime when something like that occurs. They may see a situation that occurred between consenting adults. And so it's very difficult for them to make the same kind of decision that we would make. And that time delay comes in when we are granted that secondary jurisdiction. Our recourse is to request support from the Office of Complex Investigations at the National Guard Bureau. That's kind of their federal solution to not having CID in the states. And the challenge is they'll send a team out then and do those investigations. But as you can imagine, because they support all 54 states and territories, they have a massive workload and a long lag time in getting in here and doing those investigations. We can then use the results of those investigations to take both administrative and non-judicial and judicial actions inside the Minnesota Code of Military Justice. But again, that time lag is horrendous with regard to our service members at this time. And we really feel like having the BCA involved early will result in investigations that we can take action on much earlier in the process than is the current case. And it fills that gap for us that we really don't have available to us from the federal government.
Thank you, Mr. Kerr. I appreciate that detailed walkthrough of some of the important elements here. And to me, it sort of speaks to, in many ways, sort of the unique nature of the Guard itself and how it has been structured in relationship to numerous jurisdictions from federal to the very localized one. What I do hear Representative Muller, is a strong will on the part of the Guard and of civilians and of legislators to move in terms of responding to this time lag issue. And it seems your bill will allow us to do that. And I also hear that there's an ongoing agenda here that needs to be worked on. And so I look forward to this committee being a partner in doing that work with everyone here. Representative Muller, your bill, what I have here is that we're going to lay this over. And I think the reason for that, Representative Muller, has to do with fiscal costs. We are directing over to the State Bureau of Criminal Apprehension. So I'm just wondering if you can just say a few words about costs and to provide some context for the need at this point to lay this bill over, which for everyone just really means that the bill would then come back up as we put together our fiscal omnibus bill. But I just want to check that with you, Representative Muller.
Yeah. Lost my earpiece there. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me okay?
Yes,
okay, great. So you should have received the fiscal note, but I have been in touch with the BCA about this. There's a question about some of the numbers that were used, and we're trying to get some more specific data from the Guard or clarify the data that we have on that. So if anything, the number is going to go down, and I'm hopeful that that will be the case. But that's where we are with respect to the fiscal note and I think why this bill would be laid over.
Okay, very well. I just don't want anyone to misinterpret what our motion would be, given the urgency and it looks like really strong desire on the part of everyone to act here, that it really is more about making sure that we've got that we're allocating the resources or recognizing the resources needed to do the work called for in this bill. Representative Muller, any final comments before we move to layover?
Yes, Mr. Chair, and I don't want to forget to mention the letter that's in your packet from another survivor, and I would encourage members to please read that letter. I know that Ms. Shull wanted to read that out loud, but in the interest of time, it isn't doing that, but it's still very important. And I think it just highlights again the courage and the bravery of these survivors who have shared their story with us. As Ms. Shull has talked about, the weight of the burden really has been on her. She's been a real leader among other survivors in bringing this forward. It's why we've referred to this bill as Shayla's Law, but it really represents so many of the survivors who have either brought their stories forward or who are living with that pain every day. And we want to make this system better for all of them. So thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our testifiers and to the members of this committee.
Indeed, thank you, Representative Muller. I did read a letter. I would encourage everyone to read it as well. So to all our testifiers here today, particularly our courageous survivors and strong advocates for justice, I want to thank you as well for being with us here today. At this point, Representative Muller, the chair will lay over House File 295 for possible inclusion in our omnibus finance bill. Thank you, Representative Muller.